Hi, welcome to the code approach for Lakewood Zoning Code Update. My name is Samantha Suter with Meta Urban Design. I will be joined today by Peter Park with Peter J. Park, City Planning and Design, to walk you through our slides. Today's presentation is organized in 3 sections. The first is covering the guidance for the code update. The second is the bulk of the presentation, and it's when we'll present the code update approach. Then we'll conclude with next steps. Section 1, Introduction. The purpose of the code update is to produce an innovative, user-friendly code that implements the comprehensive plan, addresses community development and zoning needs, and one that will be easily understood by all code users. Last October, City Council established by Resolution 3 values that the code update is based on. They are 1, to support affordable, attainable, and more inclusionary housing. 2, to increase mixed-use density in areas that are walkable and bikeable. And 3, to prioritize environmental and energy sustainability and conserve water use. As part of that resolution, City Council established priorities, and 2 of those that are more directly related to the code update are summarized on this slide. The first is to create a zoning rewrite that is bold, imaginative, and embraces innovation and the diversity of needs for the full city of Lakewood. This includes strategies that target missing middle housing, including naturally occurring affordable housing and market rate housing that is more affordable and attainable. The second priority is to shift away from uniformly mandating single-family zoning. These strategies include legalizing historic building patterns, increasing housing choice, raising property values over time, and promoting naturally occurring affordable and attainable housing. In addition to the City Council values and priorities, the code update will incorporate recent changes to state law, which include removing restrictions to ADUs, prohibiting minimum parking requirements in certain instances, increasing density near transit, and removing limits to residential occupancy throughout the city. City staff discussed the state law changes with the community. Specifically, they discussed the shift away from regulating residential occupancy, or the number of people living in a unit, and focusing more on the size and design of the building instead. Key to this strategy is creating regulations that are based on the existing context of the neighborhood, though. The group expressed support for relaxing the unit distinctions while creating contextually based size and design regulations. Lastly, the code update will be based on the recommendations in the comprehensive plan, including the future land use designations and map. The future land use plan defines intensity and form through the low form and mid form residential categories. This will guide future growth, and it's also going to inform the updates to the residential zone districts. This foundation is important because it supports a better code. However, it's only one factor that we will consider as we update the code. The existing built context will also inform the code changes. The code will establish context-specific standards to align the growth of the neighborhood to the existing patterns. But what defines these patterns in the residential context specifically? The code approach following will describe how we layer the future land use vision, the existing built environment, and the existing zoning to update and improve the zoning. Now that we outlined the background guidance that will inform the code update, let's dive into the actual approach. The code update approach is summarized in these 5 key recommendations. This section of the presentation will walk through each one in greater detail. The first recommendation is to calibrate standards based on the existing residential context. This is a similar approach to what the City of Lakewood has already done for the mixed-use zones, and the residential zones too should be calibrated by the existing context. We'll do this by analyzing the existing block, lot, and building patterns. We understand that one size does not fit all. As we mentioned already, it's important to calibrate the updated zoning standards to the existing context. To determine the context, our team analyzed the existing street and block pattern. We looked at the time period when neighborhoods were built. We analyzed these areas by zoning, and then also looked at the size of both the lots and buildings that make up these different areas. And what we found was primarily two predominant patterns. The first pattern we saw we will refer to as the urban residential context. The older parts of Lakewood, those areas built primarily before the 1960s, predominantly make up this context. You can see we've highlighted those in green on the map. We've also shown what the block pattern looks like in these areas. They're typically rectilinear blocks, and they provide strong connectivity and access. The second predominant pattern we identified we're referring to as suburban residential. These are areas that were built after 1960, and it makes up most of Lakewood's residential areas, approximately 72%. The block pattern is curvilinear, it's less regular and often ends in cul-de-sacs. When we look at which zone districts make up which residential contexts, we see that the same zones show up in both contexts. So this is an indication that we need to move away from this one-size-fits-all approach and calibrate the zone districts to the actual existing context that it makes up. The table on the right, you can see the different color zone districts. And for example, R16 is the most ubiquitous residential zone district, and it shows up both in the urban context and the suburban context. In summary, the first code approach recommendation is to calibrate the residential zones to the existing context. This is building off the context that the city has already adopted with the mixed-use zone districts, and you can see the comparison of the proposed residential contexts next to the existing mixed-use contexts. In the later parts of the presentation, we'll do a deeper dive into what these zone districts look like in the different contexts. But for now, we just want to emphasize the point that a key recommendation is to calibrate the zones based on the existing context where they're currently found. Recommendation number 2 is to simplify the residential use regulations. Our proposal is to do that by removing the restrictions on occupancy and the number of units allowed on a lot, and simplify the way residential use is regulated in Lakewood. This table shows the current residential uses by the residential zones. You can see there's different uses for single-family dwelling unit, accessory dwelling unit, and so on. The recommendation is to consolidate the various residential uses that exist today into one category for all residential uses and allow that as a permitted use in each residential zoning district, as shown on this slide. Recommendation number 3 is to increase compatible housing options in residential areas. The main strategy here is to allow more housing options by regulating the building size, the overall mass and scale, not the number of units in the building. We're also exploring allowing multiple smaller buildings on certain large lots. The strategy also includes updating the zone districts to be consistent with the new residential low form and residential mid form land uses based on the future land use map and the proposed contexts. We're also calibrating lot sizes to support housing goals while responding to the existing block and lot patterns based on the context. To explain this recommendation, we'll walk you through a series of modeling work that we've done for the R16 zone district in both the urban and the suburban contexts. We're looking at R16 because it's the most ubiquitous zone in the city, and it makes up a large portion of both the urban and the suburban residential contexts. To start, we're looking at the R16 zone district in the urban context. We found that the average lot size in this subset is just over 9,000 square feet, and the average building size in this area is 1,250 square feet. Most homes are about 1 story. Some are a little taller than that. This is what a typical block face looks like based on the average lot size and the average building size in the R16 zone district in the urban context. The next series of slides will show different scenarios for the interior lot and the corner lot highlighted on this graphic. Our starting point in the code modeling is to illustrate what is allowed under the current code. This graphic shows a maximum build-out that's consistent with the current standards in the R16 zone district. As you can see, the current zoning allows a home much larger than this surrounding context. So what if the zoning limits the overall building size without limiting the number of units? This scenario illustrated here shows a building size that's limited to 2,500 square feet for a single family residential use. All other standards illustrated here are consistent with the current code. And this is illustrating a single building, 2,500 square feet, and one unit in that building. If we were limiting the overall building size to 2,500 square feet, but we're allowing multiple units within that building, someone could build a duplex with 2 units that are 1,250 square feet each. This illustration is showing that in a stacked configuration. It's important to note that duplexes could also be front and back or side to side, and we can calibrate some design standards around what the duplex should look like and how it should relate to the street. This scenario explores a triplex in the same building size and shape. So 3 units, each are about 833 square feet in this same building size and shape. We're starting to get to the point that people might not build this because the units are getting smaller than what the market may be demanding. But we want to illustrate what this can look like, again, if we're just regulating the size of the building and not the number of units within the building. The last scenario in this context is a fourplex. And again, we think this is getting to the point of not being market feasible, that each unit might be too small at 625 square feet per unit. But based on the way that we're proposing to calibrate the zoning standards, this would be possible per the zoning. The zoning wouldn't be getting in the way of somebody building small micro units. And small units like this would be more affordable or attainable and offer a variety of price points for the market, which is consistent with City Council's goals. So what does this idea look like in the suburban context? To unpack this, we'll show you a series of models in the R16 zone district in a suburban context. And while there are aspects that are the same, it is important to note that the lots are a little larger, they're a little more square in shape, and the buildings are a little larger in this context currently. Here's what the typical block face looks like in the suburban context for the R16 zone district. We're showing buildings that are on average 2,000 square feet. Many of the homes are closer to 2 stories in this zone district, and the lot sizes are just over 9,400 square feet. And again, they're more square in shape. Under the current code, in this context, the buildings can get even larger. The interior lot is getting up to 18,000 square feet in this scenario. Again, this is following the existing standards in the R16 and is meant to show our starting point in terms of what is currently allowed per the code. Here's what a 2,500 square foot single family building, again with 1 unit in the structure, would look like in the R16 zone districts in the suburban context. With the larger lot sizes and the larger homes in the surrounding area, it may be worth considering increasing the size from 2,500 in this context to something even larger. Now that we looked at how R16 varies between the urban and the suburban context and what limiting the house size to 2,500 square feet would look like, we wanted to introduce another concept we are exploring, which is the cottage cluster idea. We're recommending to allow multiple buildings on certain larger lots, as illustrated here. This is an example of a 3-unit cottage cluster on a 12,800 square foot lot on the corner, and a 5-unit cottage cluster on a 16,000 square foot lot in the interior. We're still studying what lot size to allow this building type. Some cities recommend 12,000 and above, some go down as low to 10,000 and above. But we wanted to illustrate this concept for you today and point out that this is consistent with the comp plan recommendations and the council priorities to allow middle housing building types in these residential areas. In summary, the third code recommendation is to increase the compatible housing options in residential areas. We're recommending targeting changes to the zone districts as summarized on this slide, which include organizing new residential zone districts based on the new land uses coming out of the comp plan. We're also including the existing context as an organizing feature, and we're recommending reducing the minimum parcel size to 12,500 square feet in the lower, more suburban districts, and shifting some of the minimum parcel sizes around in the other zone districts based on the context. For example, we looked closely at the R16 zone district and that it varies by context. So we're recommending splitting that zone district into 2 and calibrating the minimum parcel size and design standards based on whether it is in an urban or suburban context. Lastly, we explored reducing the allowed building size to 2,500 square feet for a single structure. Yet we may increase that minimum building size in some zones and some contexts where the houses are on average larger than others in the city. Additionally, we explored allowing cottage cluster as a building type. And while that's not represented on this table, that is one of the primary recommendations that we explored in this section of the presentation. Recommendation number 4 is to simplify and update the zoning regulations for the mixed-use zone districts. We're specifically looking at the mixed-use employment zone, ME. This zone currently requires 50% commercial use in every building. Our recommendation is to expand the housing capacity and housing options in these areas currently zoned ME by removing the 50% requirement. We're also considering rezoning these areas to zones that allow residential and don't require commercial uses as another strategy to achieve this goal. We're also exploring increasing contextual transitions between zones. We're looking at expanding the area where the current 45-degree bulk plane applies in the transitions between residential and mixed-use zones. And we're looking at ways of making sure that it's based on the actual zone district and not the actual building or use that's on the site, which is how it's currently written in the code. Additionally, these transitions may be addressed through mapping a transition zone. The fifth and final recommendation is to improve the format and usability of the code. Currently, Lakewood's zoning code is pretty simple and clean. It's well organized. But graphics provide limited content. You could see the example here is relying still on a lot of text. So that's something we want to improve with the code update, is just increase the use of graphics and the integration of graphics and text to make it more user-friendly. There are also some issues that we already know exist within the current code. So we want to clarify, update terms, and address some of these known issues. The updated code needs to be accessible with alt text, color contrast, and it will be formatted for Municode, so it can be an interactive online published code. This is an example of what more robust content with illustrations may look like in Municode. This is Greeley, Colorado's code, and you can see the use of graphics and tables and text to explain the residential design standards and the building design standards. Lastly, we wanted to highlight other topics related to code cleanup of known issues. This list here is a summary of potential code changes based on these known issues. and they would ensure that the Lake Woods Code would come into compliance with state law, with the comp plan recommendation, and City Council values and priorities. We've covered a number of these already in the presentation today, but there can be more detail found on these in the packets associated with the meeting. In summary, the code update approach that we shared today is based on these 5 key recommendations. We look forward to hearing what you think about these recommendations and answering any questions that have come up as you review this information. Now that we've walked through our recommendations, we want to touch on what's next in this process. Following this meeting with Planning Commission, staff will introduce the comp plan and zoning changes to City Council at a study session on March 17th. After incorporating Planning Commission and City Council's recommendations into the comp plan and zoning code, Planning Commission will hold the first of 2 public hearings on both of these items as an update on April 2nd, followed by a second public hearing on April 16th. If the Planning Commission adopts the comprehensive plan and recommends approval of the zoning code amendments, the comprehensive plan will move to the City Council for approval on May 12th and the first reading of the zoning code amendments. And on June 9th, City Council will hold a public hearing to consider approval of the zoning code amendments. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and we look forward to hearing what you think about this material.